The seasonal artifact is going to give you the tools that you need to defeat champions, our new hardest enemies in the new Nightfall modes.
When you put like champs in this, and then it just restricts your loadouts even further, and then they say you're not forced to use a loadout, well, it's like, well, I kind of am.
I'm very tired of getting in the situation where I don't really find champions kind of a good realization of difficulty.
Champions aren't always bad, it's just that the way they're currently being handled is not great.
This is the year that I think Bungie needs to do something about champions.
Heya. If you don't know me, my name's what you'd expect. Or Josh, because this is a lot of letters. For the past 7 years, I've been infatuated with a certain game by the name of Destiny. Beginning during the Dark Below expansion, I've poured thousands upon thousands of hours into this franchise, raiding every week when I got home from school, multiple times, even when I wasn't earning any loot, just because I enjoyed it so much. Between the fantastical gameplay, weapon grind, and crazy over-the-top exotic weapons and armor, I was instantly hooked. Once Destiny 2 released, I hopped on the initial bandwagon, playing on both Xbox and PC, but it didn't meet what I expected it to, which was that top-tier power fantasy of being this unstoppable alien killing machine, able to deliver death and destruction just by looking at these races funny. I tuned in for a few months before I ended up completely abandoning the franchise. From there, I occupied my time with other activities like school and other games. Around the end of the Forsaken era, going into the Shadowkeep expansion, I hopped back on board with my roommate and friends at the time. What I logged into was a golden age of content. Multiple raids, secret missions, returning and new exotic weaponry and armor, subclass revamps, and me and my clan of buddies had a field day. Specifically on this channel, if you were around many years ago, you would have been able to see many different videos I've uploaded on this game, some of which I still have up to this day. But it's been almost a year since my last public Destiny video, and that's mainly because I never felt like I had the ability to talk with any sort of conviction on any of these topics. What could I say that Datto or Astacross or Bife or any of these other massive content creators and people who play this game for a living can't? I figured it'd be best to stick with semi-high production for my standards and just make these mini meme type videos. You guys have any good jokes?
No.
I got a joke.
Play
Do you guys
some
want to hear my
Fortnite
joke?
in a bit. What?
Swords in PvP. But after Beyond Light's poor initial reception, me and my clan kind of fell apart for one reason or another. The decision to remove previously existing content is one that still plagues the game to this day, and I could absolutely be talking about a lot of the game's failures between the new player experience, lack of in-game LFG at the time of writing exotic weapons, the horrendous seasonal artifact, or even taking a dive play elements for content, but that's not what I want to primarily focus on today. The main reason I fell off after Beyond Light, and why I worry about the future of the game, it took me a while to figure out. But most of my issues circle back to one central topic. Let's talk about champions. In any MMO, or any video game really, you need mini-boss level enemies interspersed throughout regular gameplay in order to prevent your game from feeling stale. And this rings true for Destiny as well. Especially after so many years of the same enemy designs, you need more variety with these enemies if you're not going to add in new races. Beyond Light and the Witch Queen added in a couple new varieties of enemy, with the Vex Wyverns and Fallen Brigs, before they eventually added in the Lucent Brood. These targets are high priority and extremely threatening. But before that, Shadowkeep added in what seemed like an insignificant change to the game that ended up completely altering the content on the higher end of the spectrum. Champions are an enemy type that come in 3 varieties: Unstoppable, Barrier, and Overload. Unstoppable champions need to be staggered, otherwise they'll have super high damage resistance. Barrier champions need their shield pierced, or else they'll heal through all your damage. And overload champions need to be overloaded to stop their constant health regen. In theory, this is a neat concept. You have these bigger, tougher enemies that need to be dealt with in a specific way. That's what the Lucent Hive and these other bigger enemies do as well. So what makes champions different in this regard? Champions can only be dealt with by certain weapons that correspond with the champion type. Barrier scout rifles can pierce shields, unstoppable shotguns can charge up a big shot to stagger, and overload bows can stop health regen on hit. There are also exotic weapons with built-in anti-champion capabilities, and each season rotates out what weapons do and don't have champion stunning abilities. Okay, so just put these weapons on and you'll be golden, right? Well, sort of. There's nothing inherently wrong with the concept of putting specific weapons on to deal with specific enemies. But with a game as massive as Destiny, with hundreds and hundreds of different guns, archetypes of those guns, potential builds with the mods and subclass options to go with them, it starts to fall apart pretty fast. Destiny 2 has a steady flowchart of difficulty progression for most content. Normal, Hero, Legend, Master, and Grandmaster. Everything above Hero tier involves champions in one way or another, meaning to even run something like the seasonal PsyOps Battlegrounds, you're highly incentivized into using champion-related mods, or in other words, guns you most likely do not want to use. And if you don't use these guns, you're not going to complete the activity. Not you're going to struggle with the activity, you are not going to complete the activity, especially considering a lot of these activity rewards are built around killing all of the required champions. I like the idea of having to put in effort to kill big, high-priority targets that pose a large threat to your success, especially considering we already have instances like that in-game. The initial thought process was that Bungie wanted to limit player loadouts and challenge them via combat instead of mechanics. It's a lot easier to say you're not completing this encounter without a scout rifle than it is to make an entirely new mechanic for this one activity. The most striking thing to me is that this seemingly massive gameplay shift was hardly ever acknowledged by Bungie during its release to my knowledge. It's not listed within the Shadowkeep roadmap, not in any TWABs, nowhere. Tucked away deep within a Shadowkeep Vidoc, they give like 2 sentences of context and some gameplay.
The seasonal artifact is going to give you the tools that you need to defeat champions, our new hardest enemies in the new Nightfall modes.
We're calling it Nightfall the Ordeal, so the players can choose how hard they want their difficulty to be. The further up you move in difficulty, the more likely you are to get the kind of rewards that you're looking for.
I won't dwell on champions and their design for too much longer, as this is one of my main points that will lead me towards the main objective of the video. This is but one of multiple pillars that I want to discuss. Directly linked with champions, however, is match game. One of the main pillars of the gameplay of Destiny revolve around the 3 elemental damage types: Solar, Arc, and Void. There's also Stasis and upcoming Strand, but at the time of me writing this, there are no Stasis shields in-game, so we'll ignore that for now. These elements permeate throughout your subclass, your armor mods, and your weapons. Primarily, it's meant to deal extra damage to shields of a matching element. So if you shoot a solar shield with a solar gun, you do extra damage, and breaking it gets you this cool explosion effect. If you don't match the element, then you just break it in a slower amount of time. That is, until you see this modifier: Match Game. Match Game makes it so that all elemental shields are extremely resistant to all unmatched elemental damage. It will take substantially longer to break a shield if you don't match the element type. Much like champions, on paper, this doesn't sound like a terrible idea. But when you're worrying about 2 to 3 different champion types and 3 different types of elements, and you're attempting to coordinate this with your fire team, it very quickly starts taking the fun out of what is supposed to be the most enjoyable aspect of this game: making and using your builds. The wacky shoot a fusion rifle and chain lightning to 20 enemies build isn't viable because there aren't any champion mods for fusion rifles right now, and there are no arc shielded enemies in this activity. If I try to make this work, I'll faceplant directly into a barrier champion or multiple non-matching shields that will straight up invalidate me and the build I'm trying to make work. If we can't make builds like this work in the end game, then why make them? Why do this when you can do this? Only there's even more incentive to do this one because, hey, this one's got a champion mod on it. While this is a very top of the ladder take, it's still something that I think should be considered. If this match game champion combo only exists and is only a problem in the hardest content in the game, then why shouldn't we expect balance for it if it's not being used anywhere else? especially when you combine both match game and champions together. You'll end up with something like Master Raids. At the time of me writing this script, Master King's Fall has not released yet, so I'll instead be discussing the 2 Master Raids currently in the game, being Vault of Glass and Vow of the Disciple. Both of these raids do essentially the same thing. Crank the light level up to just over regular master level content, so you'll probably be underleveled, add in a ton of champions, and then toggle match game on and give a bunch of enemies shields. Whereas Nightfalls and seasonal activities were very mechanic light and could therefore somewhat pass with the inclusion of these two, adding in an extra layer of difficulty within the combat throws a wrench in the whole raid system. In practice, I like the idea of adding in more threatening enemies to make me care about combat more during a raid, especially because at this point most of the trash mobs just fall over to a single shot from my grenade launcher. But instead of adding in enemies that force you to creatively work around their strengths, yeah, as creative as this is, I guess, it instead just narrows down the pool of weapons and armor and subclasses that are good to be used in these activities. Vow is definitely the bigger offender of the two, as encounters like Exhibition really push your team to the breaking point, having to deal with 2 different shield types and 2 different alternating champion spawns while trying to remember which 2 of the 12 symbols that are being called are actually important, and allowing each relic holder to do their respective job while also trying not to die to the extremely dense clusterfuck rooms and coordinating which teammate that doesn't have a relic could shoot the shields off. Now, there is an argument to be made that this is a level of combat difficulty to deal with. The game has presented harder combat in front of you to do while you focus on mechanics. To that end, I would agree. My retort is that this isn't fun. Having a giant checklist of things to keep in your brain during an encounter like this is fine, and we're no stranger to it in Destiny with encounters like Riven and Valk'Or. But when you squeeze these extra requirements in and have them at the same priority level as the actual mechanics, I personally feel like the fun factor of Destiny and endgame content is not there anymore. Why? Buildcrafting. During the Beyond Light era, the first new elemental damage type and subclass was introduced to us. Stasis, designed around freezing, slowing, and crowd control. Despite terrorizing PvP for a while, Stasis has come into its own as a unique subclass that's quite fun in almost all areas of the PvE game. Hell, if you've noticed, my channel icon is my Stasis Warlock set. With Stasis came the Aspects and Fragment system. Aspects were the main abilities like turn your grenade into a Stasis turret, or fire an ice shockwave upon rift cast, and each aspect gave you fragment slots. Fragments were smaller, more build-centric boosts, like freezing a target grants you a stats boost. Weapons like Agger's Scepter only added onto this already insane cool buildcrafting beta concept, allowing crazy shit like this. Before Witch Queen's launch, it was announced that the light subclasses would be getting updated to this stasis formula, using aspects and fragments. Now that we finally have all of them here, I can say with some authority on the subject at how fantastic they are. I recently put out a forum to both my friends and the Destiny 2 subreddit asking them among other things how they felt about buildcrafting as of Arc 3.0, and an overwhelming 69.6% of people said they enjoyed it. Comboing double fusion grenade explosions into an anarchy chain while blasting fusion rifle shots down at a boss. Invis stealthing your way through an entire raid encounter, or throwing some of the most powerful grenades the game has ever seen. Every class has seen success in one way or another. Combining this with new and unique weapon perks that enhance our buildcrafting gameplay, along with new powerful weapons like Storm Chaser. Add on armor mods that enhance these already crazy builds even further. Buildcrafting is one of the main reasons that I personally have stuck around in Destiny. But when we loop back to master level content, it starts to break down. It's not unusual for MMOs to have top-tier options for high-end content, but with a game that pushes the freedom of builds as hard as this does, why am I only ever really going to be effective with this one specific exotic when there's 20 other ones I could technically be using here? It feels like all of these creative and unique builds are all being bottlenecked at the top end. When you're roped into using the same build, and the same weapons, and the same playstyle, all of these great elements start to disappear. Why bother with any of these exotics when you could go with the one that will perform well enough to complete this activity? Yeah, you could go with Phoenix Protocol over Starfire Protocol, but why would you limit yourself like that? Why bother with any of these weapons when these are the only ones that have champion mods? When it comes to these issues of match game, build crafting, and champions, there's one weapon that sticks out like a sore thumb that I don't think I can handle not talking about anymore. That weapon is Arbalest. Arbalest is a kinetic slot linear fusion rifle that does a few things. First off, it ignores match game. It will bring down any elemental shield from 100 to 0. When you break a shield, it also gives you a damage buff with kinetic weapons and refills your magazine with the catalyst. So you get to bypass match game with this weapon. Guess what? It does the exact same thing against barrier champions. 100 to 0 with one shot, and you get all the same benefits. So, buildcrafting is already being limited in the endgame by a very specific selection of weapons with champion mods, but we can go ahead and limit it even harder by making these 3 anti-barrier mods completely obsolete. And you could go ahead and limit it again, because you're probably running another champion mod in your secondary slot. Nearly every single endgame experience just boils down to this one homogeneous paste of equip Arbalest, equip champion modded weapon, equip powerful heavy weapon, and subclass that matches the element burn. Now to clarify, I don't want outright removal of champions or match game. I don't believe there's one effective build for endgame, and I'm not saying it's impossible to have fun in hard content with Destiny. You can absolutely run a Liar's Handshake combination blow 1-2 punch Arc Hunter and be running around one-tapping champions. I've said it many times so far, the concepts behind these things are good, and a lot of the issues I have, you could also argue, are game balance related. The execution is what bogs me down personally, especially because it feels like they've gotten so close to properly fair combat difficulty with things like Hive Guardians. I'm not here to be a martyr preaching a message about removing champions, but what I am here to do is talk about why the Lightblade Grandmaster Nightfall epitomizes every single issue I have with Destiny 2. Grandmaster difficulty is reserved for one activity in the game, and that is the Nightfall. To even enter Grandmaster Nightfalls, henceforth referred to as GMs, you need to be Pinnacle Cap on your gear, which is the highest you could get to for that current season, as well as a plus 15 power boost from your seasonal artifact, or, in layman's terms, a metric fuckton of XP. These Nightfalls are on a 6-strike rotation for each season, and come with challenging modifiers such as kicking you to orbit if you wipe, allowing you to deal 25% more elemental damage but take 50% more of that element's damage, capping your power level so you'll be 25 levels under, limiting the amount of revives you can have, alongside the usual legend and above modifiers like locking your loadout. This seems like the perfect storm of endgame difficulty, and with actual great rewards to boot, this might be the greatest solution to our previous endgame problems. Let me check what these other modifiers are. So let's review. Endgame content is inaccessible unless you put on champion mods and specific elements. These problems are alleviated or outright negated by Arbalest, which in turn limits the fantastic buildcrafting even more, as your special weapon is occupied and your primary weapon is likely another champion mod to cover your bases. Add in all of this previous GM specific modifiers that I mentioned, and it makes for an experience that is quite mixed. Strikes like Devil's Lair, I think, are the perfect GM level content. Plenty of threatening enemies that will not hesitate to one-shot snipe you, big targets like Briggs and Walker tanks that require smart positioning to not immediately get annihilated, quite a few safe spots to stand throughout the strike, including the boss room, and plenty of regular run-of-the-mill enemies so you could still feel like you're fragging out. Devil's Lair at the time of writing this is the only GM I've ever soloed, and it was a very fun experience. Link in the description if you want the raw footage, copyrighted music and all. And once you finally get to the end of a GM Nightfall, and you see this?
Yeah, we got platinum.
Cool. You think, oh, this is where I'm gonna live now. So you gear up and you prepare as best you can for all the other GM strikes in the game. And then, if you're like me, you faceplant directly into the wall that is the Lightblade. Speaking of faceplanting, my Discord server. Much like my YouTube career at large, my Discord is jam-packed full of people falling flat on their faces, and also sometimes they make fun of me for playing Destiny. If you'd like early access to videos like this, or you just want to tell me I'm a very nice and cool person with a massive penis, link is in the description. The Lightblade is split up into 4 sections: opening, boat, lamp, and boss. Throughout the strike, you'll encounter barrier knights, unstoppable ogres, and abominations, hive guardians, and occasionally the boss who spits arc energy at you. Since you're on GM difficulty and are not only underleveled but are also taking 50% more arc damage, you will die in 1 or 2 hits to nearly everything. Even non-arc damage like Hive Guardian suppressor grenades and shield throws will wipe your team. So let's loop this back around to my 3 central issues, starting with build crafting. What do you even bring into this place? Well, there are barrier champions, so you almost certainly need Arbalest, along with an unstoppable weapon of some kind, which is usually a pulse rifle, then something that could quickly take out champions and high priority targets like a linear fusion rifle. This is the de facto loadout to make this place as bearable as possible, but now you have to start making trade-offs with your build. On Warlock, for example, my options are as follows. Void Warlock with Devour and Suppressor Grenades to shut down Hive Guardian super targets. Arc to speed through the lamp section unimpeded. Solar for massive ad clear and support capabilities, or Stasis for crowd control. This concept of having to make clear trade-offs to perform differently/better within the mission works. Until you factor in all of this shit. There is no building around Arbalest or any trade-offs that you have to make. There is very little building around your other 2 weapons, so your subclass choice makes very little difference in the grand scheme. I want to use Aggroceptor here, because I can combine it with my Stasis subclass and Mantle of Battle Harmony to have massive amounts of AoE freeze, getting tons of super energy, feeding it back into the gun. I want to use Collective Obligation, because I can combine it with my Void subclass and apply a weaken, suppress, and volatile effect to every enemy within my scope. I want to run Delicate Tomb and create these huge lightning chains between enemies and bolstering my ability energy gains tenfold while even assisting my allies by giving them energy. Sure, sometimes you'll get Overload Trace Rifle, or Unstoppable Pulse Rifle for the 5th season in a row, or Unstoppable Fusion Rifle. And there will be certain strikes where some things just aren't viable. But I don't see how waiting until 2026 for trace rifles to get an anti-barrier mod for me to use in the Lightblade when it's in the strike rotation is allowing me to build craft the way Bungie expects me to and the way that I think I should be able to. Regarding champions, putting Hive Guardians in the same top level activity as champions works exactly how you think it does. Hive Guardians have interesting abilities that require methodical counterplay and for you to get in close to properly finish them off. When paired with champions, they become more annoying than interesting. When you try to burst down a barrier champion just to make it safe to cross and finish a ghost, you're getting bombarded with suppressor nades, shield throws, and whenever you want to hit him, he throws up his barricade. Unless you got Arbalest, lol. These 2 ideologies contrast with each other so hard that when you combine them in an endgame underleveled 50% more damage taking environment, it sucks whatever remaining amount of fun there was out of the activity. And bear in mind, we're only in the first real room of the strike. It would be relatively easy to simply throw a suppression nade at this Hive Guardian to shut him down and stop him from team wiping us. But actually I'm on Solar because we needed the elemental shield requirement, because even with Arbalest you can't count on your other teammates being alive. Case in point. After the opening, we transition to the boat. Take all of the grenade spamming, rapid fire death dealing enemies from earlier, but hyperfixate their accuracy onto one small moving platform that you can't place rifts or barricades onto. Sony bought this company for $3.6 billion, by the way. And it goes exactly how you think it does. That is, if you actually take the boat. The much smarter and really only option is to hop off the boat as soon as you can and methodically work your way through. GM difficulty is so brutal that sections like this are actively avoided. Not a knock against the game itself, just interesting that people at the highest end of the spectrum go out of their way to avoid mechanics as much as possible, because that would be too hard. Kill all the enemies within the canal, walk through the teleporter and refuse to hop back onto the boat where all the thrall are swarming, because again, games are hard. Following this is the lamp section, where you are constantly given a weight of darkness that reduces your sprint speed and your jumping capabilities that could be reduced by standing at these lamps. Yes, this was ripped straight out of D1, how could you guess? This is probably my favorite section of the whole strike, because not only is it a mechanic that you cannot avoid, it also serves its intended purpose on this difficulty, even if you can negate most of the danger with an Invis Hunter or an amplified speed boost. After a short section where you blast everything from a distance, it's time for the real game. The boss fight against Alakul. This is where I get my kicks in Destiny, let me tell ya. Without doing this kiting technique, the boss will actively sprint towards you at a high velocity, fire arc shockwave attacks that will one-tap you behind cover, and stand there menacingly, which does some psychic damage. On top of this, he's got health gates to spawn threatening mobs, including but not limited to Barrier Knights, Light Barrier Knights, Melee Arc Shield Knights, Fire-throwing Acolytes, and Exploding Curse Thrall. Some of those spawns that they time specifically as you get to the boss to half health, where he becomes even more aggressive. I love video games, This boss fight perfectly epitomizes everything I outlined earlier about Destiny's issues. Without champions, without match game, without insanely limiting our build crafting potential, this has the ability to be a really fun and challenging boss. Keep the other GM modifiers. Keep the extra arc damage and the ability to one-tap me with these arc shockwaves and suppressor grenades. Keep all of this stuff that punishes me for playing out of turn, having bad positioning, or not taking out the right high-priority targets. But when you also force me to worry about champion mods, elemental shields, or attempting to negate either of these with one god gun, that's where I start to take issue. I want to take a little break and divert over towards that forum I mentioned earlier. On that forum were some questions about champions, buildcrafting, and match game. I'll link the full forum results down below if you'd like to read them for yourself, but here are the ones I found interesting. Overall opinion on champions was around 50% negative, match game was around 61% negative, and as mentioned previously, 69.9% of people vastly enjoy buildcrafting. When asked if champions limit their buildcrafting potential, 72% of people agreed, and a whopping 87% of people said they'd rather fight Lucent Hive over champions. One of the most interesting comments was about which champions people enjoyed/didn't enjoy fighting. Quote, "A sore spot for me with the champions are that a few of them aren't as creative. The Taken especially do not seem to be meant to challenge the player in an interesting way, as some of their enemies' base designs seem to be intended to frustrate players. Hobgoblins normally do inconsequential damage, but the fact that they can lock onto players that didn't attack them makes it even more ridiculous when you add in Overload's ability cooldown. Taken phalanxes are infamous for being especially irritating, and making them unstoppable does little other than provide them a direct way to get in a player's face, where they will most certainly get a guaranteed kill unless stunned. Neither of these are unique or interesting interactions between the enemies and the player, but instead make annoying enemies into something that has frustrated me numerous times." And I think this comment nailed it. Champions don't make the original enemy variant more interesting. They don't make the act of fighting hobgoblins or captains or knights any more interesting than normal. It's just aggravating. Hiding behind cover while you wait for your teammate to take down a barrier knight or waiting for that one overload captain to stop teleporting isn't enjoyable. The same goes for a match game as well. It's definitely harder, I'll give you that, but I believe that a fun, non-champion based endgame experience is possible. They proved it with the Legendary campaign. Hell, you can even keep champions in match game in the Nightfall, where they were originally introduced. It seemed like that's where they were meant to go exclusively. But as they've creeped more and more into things like raids or even seasonal activities, the champion fatigue has worn on me personally more and more. Back to the Lightblade though. It's not necessarily the strike itself that ruffles my feathers. It is by far the hardest strike in the game, and one of the hardest activities in the game outside of solo duality, I guess. All of the problems I have with the game are amplified by a few magnitudes when in a super bullshit fuck you hard setting. I don't know what you put in the place of champions or match game, especially because the latter has been in the game since D1 and is one of the main reasons for elements in gameplay in the first place. But I know Bungie pays people much smarter than me to figure this stuff out. So this video was meant to bring attention to the problems that I have with the game that I love. If I'm horrendously out of touch and champions, match game, and buildcrafting are all perfect going into the next few years of Destiny, please let me know what you think. Otherwise, sound off in the comments below. Thank you all very much for watching, and as always, have yourselves a damn good one. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. I wanted to use this ending time to address a couple of things. First off, got hacked recently. It was very funny. They were peddling like an Elon Musk Twitter crypto scam, some bullshit like that. I don't know, but I got the account back. We're doing good. Second, I beat the entirety of Persona 5 in between the making of this video. I straight up didn't open this Premiere file for like a month, and then just like 100% the full game. And third, last off, shout out to you, Shane Shrimp, who convinced me to get off my ass and actually get this video out in time. Appreciate it.
Alright, throw on overload anything. What the fuck's going on up here?
Alex? Alex, you okay?
Oh my! Alex, I'll have you know, I've got all this on video. I'm gonna put this right at the end. Alright.
What?
Alright.
What was happening?
That was infinitely better than I ever thought it would be.
I switched some classes and waited for my grenade to recharge. I've just been
Oh my god.